Whether it be well-known faces from the world of entertainment and celebrity, or victims of some of the most scandalous crimes ever committed, we aim to dissect and timestamp the events as they occurred. Today's episode centres on an extremely polarising figure, Ruth Ellis, a Welsh nightclub hostess and convicted murderer who became the last woman to be executed in the United Kingdom following the fatal shooting of her lover, David Blakely. For some, Blakely simply had it coming, as he was known to be abusive and a bully. The physical violence and emotional debasement inflicted on Ellis, who had endured a lifetime of hurt and defilement, culminated in her shooting him at point-blank range on the 10th of April 1955. Her execution would take place on the 13th of July 1955 when she was just 28 years old, and would spark outcry and resentment towards the government and calls for women's protection moving forward. So, who was Ruth Ellis, and what kind of life did she have? What happened to her that led to her breaking point? And what events transpired after she killed David Blakely? Join us as we dissect the tragic case of Ruth Ellis, here on The Last 24. As mentioned in the introduction to this episode, and as with most of these sensitive cases, it is best to go back to the beginning, to gain an understanding of who Ruth Ellis was as a person and what kind of life she endured before the events that transpired in 1955. Let us get to know her now. Ruth Ellis was born Ruth Nielsen in the seaside town and community of Rhyl in Denbighshire, Wales, on October the 9th, 1926. Her mother, Bertha, was a Belgian refugee, and her father was a cellist from Manchester who had 6 children. Ellis was the 5th to be born. Unfortunately, her childhood would be ruined and scarred by her father. Arthur Hornby, who later changed his surname to Nielsen, began to sexually abuse Ruth and her older sister, Muriel, after his twin brother, Charles, was killed in a bicycle accident in 1928. He began abusing Muriel first. By the time she was 14 years old, she had already given birth to a baby boy, who Arthur treated as a brother to Ruth and her siblings. Though Muriel succumbed to the horrifying abuse at the hands of her father, Ruth would often fight back against Arthur, who began molesting her when she was just 11. This would go on for a few years before she was able to escape and travel to London. Whilst there, she met a married soldier from Canada named Claire Andrea McCallum, whom she got pregnant by at the age of 17. The baby was named after the father, Claire Andrea or Andy, but the relationship broke down and she was left to raise the child by herself. After working in a number of factories to try and save money in order to feed her son, Ruth decided to turn her attention to the sex industry and so began modelling nude for a man called Maurice Conley, who was known for blackmailing his employees into having sex with him. Ellis was able to take another job as a nightclub hostess in Hampstead, and by 1950 was working as an escort to service and sleep with men. It was during her time as an escort that she met George Johnson Ellis, a 41-year-old divorced dentist whom she'd married later that year at a registry office in Kent. However, not long into the marriage, her new husband became violent towards her. Despite knowing the line of work that Ruth was in, George became increasingly paranoid, convincing himself that she was cheating on him and would beat her regularly. When their daughter Georgina was born in 1951, George refused to acknowledge her as his own, and so the relationship fell apart. By 1953, Ellis was employed at the Little Club, a popular nightclub in the residential and retail district of Knightsbridge, where she was also taking elocution and etiquette classes. This would pay off as she was promoted to manager, one of the youngest women to do so at the age of 27. Things were beginning to look up for Ruth now, as the promotion garnered her more money to pay for her children as well as friends, a better quality of life and respect from those around her. However, the lifestyle that Ellis had finally managed to achieve was short-lived after she became involved with David Blakely. Privately educated at Shrewsbury School and then Sandhurst, Blakely was a race car driver who also happened to be an alcoholic. Not sensing the danger that would ensue after they met at the little club, Ellis and Blakely became serious very quickly. David would swiftly move into her apartment not long after becoming a couple, even though he was engaged to another woman at the time. Ruth would become pregnant for a fourth time but had an abortion. After feeling guilty and shame for not giving more to their relationship, she felt that a baby would complicate matters. Yet, despite her bad taste in men, Ruth began to see another man at the same time as Blakely, a former RAF pilot named Desmond Coussin, whom she moved in with at his house in Oxford Street after being sacked from her manager's position. She would continue to visit and date Blakely on a regular basis, but the situation became too volatile and complicated, with Blakely still engaged and having affairs with both men and women, and would eventually result in a heartbreaking incident in January 1955. During a heated encounter between Ruth and David, things got out of hand, culminating in David punching Ellis so hard in the stomach that she suffered a miscarriage. This would be the last straw. It would later be revealed in a serialized, ghost-written life story published in the Woman's Sunday Mirror that Ruth suffered terribly at the hands of Blakely. She stated, "He would smack my face and punch me, and once lost all control. His fist struck me between the eyes and I fell to the floor. He savagely beat me as I lay there." She would also have to provide him with money to fund his unhealthy lifestyle of cigarettes and alcohol. The constant abuse, both physical and emotional, led to the crime that would result in Ellis's execution. Blakely had distanced himself from Ruth after the miscarriage, refusing to acknowledge her or answer her telephone calls. Instead, he shacked up with his friends, but could not hide forever, as on Easter Sunday, 10th of April 1955, Ruth Ellis would take her revenge. She took a taxi from Desmond Coussin's home to a second-floor flat at 29 Tanzer Road, Hampstead, the home of Anthony and Carol Feinlater. This is where she assumed Blakely was hiding. She was correct, but had just missed him as his car drove out of the parking lot, so she quickly hailed a taxi and followed him to the Magdala, a public house in South Hill Park, where she sat, waiting for her moment. At around 9:30 p.m, Blakely and his friend Clive Gunnell appeared and headed towards the parked car. It was at this point that Ruth pulled out a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson Victory model revolver from her handbag and fired 5 shots at Blakely. After the first shot missed, she chased Blakely to the other side of the car and managed to hit her target. After he fell to the ground, she stood over him and fired 3 more bullets, killing him. The final bullet hit the ground after she repeatedly pulled the trigger, but it ricocheted and struck a bystander called Gladys Yule, injuring her hand. After killing her abusive boyfriend, Ruth Ellis stood in the middle of the street, appearing calm and collected, but was most likely in shock. She was overheard saying to Clive Gunnell, "I'm guilty. I'm a little confused. Will you call the police, Clive?" An off-duty police officer arrived quickly on the scene and immediately escorted her to Hampstead Police Station, where she confessed to the murder. Her calm demeanour was assessed and examined by doctors and psychiatrists, who concluded that she was of sane mind and showed no signs of mental illness or being under the influence of alcohol or drugs. She made her first appearance at the magistrate's court the very next day and was held on remand. Another duo of psychiatrists, Duncan Whitaker for the defence and Alexander Dalzell on the behalf of the Home Office, completed their own assessments. Neither found evidence of insanity. Then, on the 20th of June 1955, Ellis appeared in the No. 1 court of the Old Bailey in London. She appeared smart, well-dressed, and her bleach blonde hair was sitting perfectly and freshly coloured, much to the surprise of her defending counsel, Aubrey Melford Stevenson, Sebag Shaw, and Peter Rawlinson. The prosecutor posed the following question to Ellis. "When you fired the revolver at close range into the body of David Blakely, what did you intend to do?" To which she answered, "It's obvious. When I shot him, I intended to kill him." With this immediate, bold reply, it only took 20 minutes for the jury to find her guilty of murder and assign her the mandatory death sentence. While awaiting her fate at Holloway Prison, Ruth told her mother that she did not want a petition that was being assembled to contrast the death sentence. However, her solicitor, John Bickford, wrote a 7-page letter to the Home Secretary, William Lloyd George, setting out the grounds for a reprieve. The request was ultimately denied. Ellis then asked to consult with Leon Simmons, the clerk to solicitor Victor Mishcon, who represented her during previous divorce proceedings, to oversee the rest of the trial and hearings. The last 24 hours of Ruth Ellis's life began on the 12th of July 1955, where Mishcon and Simmons visited her to discuss her will. They reviewed the case as a whole and attempted to extract the full story from Ellis. However, she demanded that her retelling of the events would not generate another proposal for reprieve. Despite Mishcon refusing to neglect his client's rights, Ruth relayed the story that Desmond Cousin had given her the gun and taught her how to use it on the weekend prior to the murder, as well as driving her to the scene of the crime. She explained that "I didn't say anything about it up till now because it seemed traitorous, absolutely traitorous." After 2 hours of questioning and attempting to piece together the events from the beginning to end, Mishcon and Simmons visited the permanent secretary, Sir Frank Newsom, at the Home Office to review the case again. This last-minute attempt of absolution did not work, as authorities proceeded with the guilty verdict and authorization for execution, saying, "We cannot have people shooting off firearms in the street." Before the evening came to an end, Ellis wrote a final letter to Blakely's parents from her prison cell. She stated, "I've always loved your son, and I shall die still loving him." However, she was steadfast and unapologetic in her decision to exact revenge on him, as she firmly believed in karma, stating, "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth," and that "I'm quite happy to die." The morning had arrived. Ellis woke at 6:30 a.m. on the 13th of July and was given a tot of brandy to help with any last-minute nerves. However, it was reported that she was completely calm and confident in herself. Her last meal was a bowl of scrambled eggs. The Bishop of Stepney, Juice de Blanc, was assigned to her to administer the last rites and to be a confidant before her death. At her request, a crucifix was hung on the wall where she could see it as she walked the short distance from the condemned cell to the execution shed just before 9 a.m. There was a short delay to the proceedings after a hoax phone call was made to the prison. The person claimed to be the private secretary to Lloyd George, and that there had been a stay of execution. After a few minutes of deliberation with the Home Office, Prison Governor Charity Taylor confirmed it to be a hoax and authorized the execution to go ahead as planned. The hangman was Albert Pierrepont, who later denied in his memoirs that any untoward incident had marred the proceedings or led to his decision to retire a few months later. Ruth Ellis was hanged and died at 9:01 a.m. As was customary in British executions, Ruth was buried in an unmarked grave within the walls of Holloway Prison. The noose and murder weapon are now displayed in the Metropolitan Police Crime Museum. In the days following Ruth's death, the discussion surrounding the death penalty became very public, with newspapers and columnists attacking the government's decision to proceed with her hanging, including the novelist Raymond Chandler, who wrote a letter to the Evening Standard condemning the medieval savagery of the law. Eventually, the death penalty was halted in 1965 after the last execution occurred in 1964. Unfortunately, Ruth's death spilled over into her family's life, resulting in a series of sad events. No criminal charges were made against Desmond Cousin, even though she claimed he assisted her in the murder of Blakely. Cousin would repeatedly deny involvement and would eventually immigrate to Australia. Ruth's ex-husband George Ellis committed suicide by hanging himself in a hotel room in 1958. Her mother, Bertha, was discovered trying to gas herself in her flat in Hemel Hempstead. She was saved from killing herself, but was unable to speak properly again for the rest of her life. Ruth's children also suffered. Andy, who was 10 when Ruth died, took his own life in 1982 after destroying his mother's headstone. Her daughter Georgina was taken into foster care at 6 years old after the death of her father and would later die of cancer in 2001, aged 50. In an interview with The Guardian, Ruth's sister Muriel explained how she and her mother visited Ellis on the eve of her execution. She recalls how there was no mention of her sister's death, only small talk. She was very calm. My mum said, "Don't ask any questions and let Ruth do the talking. I just had a new baby and she said, 'What was he like?' And she said she liked the dress I had on." I believe she thought that at the last minute they'd say, "You'll go to prison instead." In the end, no matter what one thinks of Ruth Ellis, her life choices or motive for murder, she did indeed kill someone in cold blood without hesitation, which must be addressed. However, to read of her brutal childhood, abuse at the hands of the men in her life, and the acceptance of her eventual fate, one cannot help but feel a degree of sympathy and understanding of her decision to take matters into her own hands. Ellis will always be remembered as the last woman to be executed in the United Kingdom, but we hope that this episode sheds a better light on her life as a whole. Until next time, take care, folks.